The psychology of marriage. Why one wrong choice can hurt for a lifetime. There is an old saying, if you wear the wrong shoes, your feet will hurt. If you marry the wrong person, your heart may hurt for a lifetime. At first glance, this proverb sounds simple, almost too simple, but hidden within it is a profound philosophical insight about human relationships. Shoes affect only your steps, but marriage shapes the direction of your entire life. And more importantly, marriage does not involve only two individuals. It inevitably connects two families, two emotional histories, two ways of understanding the world. This is why the decision about marriage cannot be left entirely to luck, time, or hope. Especially for parents whose children are entering marriage, one question becomes quietly important. What kind of emotional structure does the future spouse carry into the relationship? Not just their manners, not just their education, not even their intentions, but their psychological architecture, the way they interpret rejection, criticism, and conflict. Because these invisible patterns determine the future of relationships far more than outward kindness. When rejection feels like existential denial. Let us begin with a fundamental psychological question. How does a person interpret rejection? For some individuals, rejection is simply situational. Someone cannot help. Someone disagrees. Someone needs time to think. But for others, rejection is not interpreted as a situation. It is interpreted as a judgment of their worth as a person. In this psychological structure, no does not mean not now. It means you are not valued. Imagine the following situations. A parent-in-law cannot grant a request because of practical limitations. Objectively, it is just circumstance. But to someone with a rejection-sensitive emotional system, the interpretation quickly becomes, they don't like me. Or consider another moment. A husband says, let me think about it. To most people, this means reflection. But to someone who processes disagreement emotionally, it may feel like betrayal. He is not on my side. And when small situations like this accumulate, something deeper happens. The issue is no longer the situation itself. The issue becomes identity and belonging. The thought emerges quietly. In this family, I am not important. Once that interpretation settles in the mind, the relationship itself begins to feel unstable, and eventually the conclusion becomes extreme. Then perhaps it is better to cut the relationship entirely. The crucial point here is philosophical as well as psychological. The problem is not rejection itself. The problem is how rejection is interpreted. Some see rejection as circumstance. Others see it as a verdict on their existence, when advice feels like judgment. Now let us consider another common dynamic in family relationships evaluation. In healthy communication, advice is simply guidance. But in certain emotional structures, advice is experienced not as help, but as judgment. Imagine a parent-in-law offering practical advice about household routines. From one perspective, it is an attempt to help someone adapt. From another perspective, however, it may feel like criticism. They are trying to teach me how to live. Similarly, conversations about family roles can easily trigger a sense of evaluation. Instead of hearing discussion about responsibilities, the listener may feel they are evaluating whether I deserve to be in this family. Even neutral situations, such as conversations in front of extended relatives, can become psychologically stressful. The person feels as if they are standing on a stage. Every word becomes a test. Every expression becomes a scorecard. Under such conditions, anxiety slowly rises. Even a casual remark that sounds like comparison can trigger deep discomfort. Over time, something subtle but important happens. The relationship stops feeling like a connection between people. It begins to feel like an environment of stress. And when relationships are perceived as stress environments, human beings instinctively do what they always do with stress. They avoid. Visits become less frequent. Phone calls become shorter. Messages remain unanswered. Distance quietly replaces connection. The philosophy of all or nothing, another pattern frequently seen in younger emotional development, is what psychologists call dichotomous thinking. In simple terms, it is the belief that relationships must be either completely good or completely bad. If someone hurts us once, we may conclude this relationship is finished. If someone makes a mistake, we may decide this is who they really are. Even apologies sometimes fail to repair the damage because the mind has already moved to a final verdict. It is too late. In philosophical terms, this is not yet a mature worldview. It is a coping strategy. When emotional uncertainty feels overwhelming, the mind simplifies reality. Instead of navigating complexity, it divides the world into two clear categories: right or wrong, friend or enemy, acceptance or rejection. But relationships are rarely that simple. Human beings are inconsistent, families are complicated, and long-term relationships survive not because they avoid mistakes, but because they allow room for repair. When thinking becomes all or nothing, that room disappears. The relationship is judged in total based on a single moment. Love becomes absolute approval. Disagreement becomes total rejection. And eventually the relationship itself is treated the same way. If it feels good, keep everything. If it hurts, discard everything. Why the 20s are still a window of change. Now we arrive at an important question. Is this dynamic permanent? The answer is surprisingly hopeful. In many cases, individuals in their 20s still have significant emotional flexibility. Their reactions are strong, but their beliefs are not yet permanently fixed. Psychological patterns during this stage are often responses, not fully formed philosophies. In other words, the behavior may appear rigid, but the underlying worldview is still developing. This is why interventions during this period often have a higher chance of success compared with individuals in their late 30s whose emotional interpretations have had many years to solidify. People in their 20s are often far more adaptable, not because they are more rational, but because their emotional reactions have not yet hardened into permanent convictions. Their distance from family may look like a final decision, yet very often it is simply an attempt to regulate overwhelming feelings. It is less a declaration of permanent separation and more a temporary effort to escape emotional pressure. This distinction is extremely important because once we recognize the difference between reaction and ideology, we begin to see possibility. What looks like rejection may actually be confusion. What looks like hostility may actually be anxiety. And what appears to be final separation may still contain the seeds of repair. Understanding before judging. The essential message of today's lecture is not to blame any individual, nor is it to criticize a generation. Rather, it is to understand the psychological mechanics that quietly shape family relationships. When we misinterpret emotional reactions as moral failures, relationships collapse quickly. But when we understand them as psychological patterns, something different becomes possible. Patience becomes possible. Dialogue becomes possible. Even reconciliation becomes possible, especially when the individuals involved are still in a stage of emotional development, where change is not only possible, but likely. Relationships do not fail simply because of conflict. They fail when conflict is interpreted as permanent judgment. If we learn to see reactions for what they truly are, temporary responses to emotional stress, then many relationships that seemed destined to collapse may still find their way back to balance. If this lecture helped you better understand the psychology of family relationships, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and sharing it with others who might benefit from this discussion. Because sometimes a deeper understanding of human psychology is all it takes to prevent a relationship from quietly breaking apart. In the previous part of this lecture, we explored an important idea. Many of the extreme reactions we see in family relationships during the 20s are not yet fixed philosophies of life. They are emotional responses, often intense, often confusing, but still fluid. In other words, what looks like a permanent decision may actually be a temporary reaction. And this distinction matters enormously, because if we misunderstand a reaction as a permanent belief, we may give up on a relationship too early. But if we recognize that we are witnessing a stage of emotional adjustment, we may still have time to guide the relationship toward stability. This brings us to the next important question. If these reactions are not yet fixed beliefs, where do they begin? To answer that question, we must look at what often happens before marriage, and then what changes after marriage begins. Before marriage. The optimism of inexperience, one of the most common patterns among young couples, is something psychologists often call optimistic simplification. Before marriage, many people in their 20s rarely think deeply about the complexity of relationships with in-laws. The issue simply does not feel real yet. If you ask them about potential conflicts with parents-in-law, the typical response might sound something like this. That kind of problem doesn't really happen anymore. Stories about difficult relationships between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law are often dismissed as relics from another generation. They had those problems in the past, someone might say, but things are different now. And because most pre-marriage meetings between families are polite, brief, and carefully managed, nothing appears threatening. A dinner conversation goes well. Everyone smiles. There is no open disagreement. And so the conclusion quietly forms in the mind. We will be fine. But here lies a subtle philosophical problem. Short encounters between families do not reveal the true structure of relationships. They only reveal polite behavior. Real relationships are not built during ceremonies, dinners, or formal introductions. They begin only when everyday life starts to unfold. And everyday life always brings differences, different habits, different expectations, different assumptions about respect, boundaries, and family roles. Before marriage, these differences remain invisible. So the decision to marry is often made without imagining how these invisible differences might eventually collide. At this stage, hope is stronger than preparation. Expectation is stronger than understanding. After marriage, when reality arrives, the real test begins only after marriage. Once daily life begins, relationships that once felt distant suddenly become immediate. Parents-in-law are no longer symbolic figures at family gatherings. They become part of the living structure of life. And for some individuals, this moment brings an unexpected emotional shock, not necessarily because something terrible has happened, but because the psychological reality of family life suddenly becomes unavoidable. For example, ordinary advice from parents-in-law may be interpreted in a completely different way. What was intended as guidance might feel like interference. A casual suggestion about household routines may be interpreted as a lack of respect. Similarly, practical questions about visiting schedules, holidays, or family traditions can become sources of stress. What once seemed like simple cultural customs may suddenly feel like obligations. Even small differences in lifestyle, how often families meet, how decisions are discussed, how responsibilities are shared, can create emotional tension. But one of the most psychologically destabilizing moments occurs when the husband attempts to remain neutral. From his perspective, neutrality may feel responsible. He may believe he is trying to understand both sides, yet for someone who feels emotionally vulnerable, neutrality can feel like abandonment. If he is not defending me, the thought emerges, then I must be alone. This emotional interpretation can quickly magnify small conflicts into larger fears. A disagreement about visiting schedules may suddenly trigger a deeper anxiety. Did I make a mistake getting married? In these moments, the emotional shock does not come only from the conflict itself. It comes from a sudden realization. This is something I must live with. The abstract idea of marriage becomes a concrete reality. And for someone who never imagined this complexity beforehand, the psychological weight can feel overwhelming. I didn't know it would be this hard. At this stage, a particular phrase begins to appear repeatedly. I didn't know marriage would be this hard. This sentence may sound like a simple complaint, but psychologically it serves a deeper function. It becomes a narrative that explains and justifies emotional withdrawal. When this phrase is repeated to friends, family members, or even to oneself, the focus gradually shifts away from specific events. Instead of describing what exactly happened, the person begins to emphasize the intensity of their feelings. I'm exhausted. I can't handle this. This is too much. When conversations turn towards solutions, discussing boundaries, communication, or compromise, the response often becomes avoidance. I don't even have the energy to think about that right now. In psychological terms, this moment is important because the withdrawal we see here is not necessarily a carefully considered decision to end a relationship. More often, it is a retreat from emotional overload. The person is not declaring a permanent separation. They are trying to escape a situation that feels psychologically unbearable. In other words, the message is not, I want to end this relationship. The message is closer to this: I cannot carry this emotional weight right now. What parents should recognize as warning signals. From the perspective of parents, these patterns can be confusing because externally, the individual may appear calm, polite, and gentle. There may be no obvious signs of hostility, but beneath that surface lies an important vulnerability. Many individuals who react this way have had relatively little experience navigating serious interpersonal conflict. They may not have developed the skills required to negotiate tension, express disagreement constructively, or maintain relationships through uncomfortable moments. As a result, when conflict finally appears, the response is often not negotiation. It is distance. Another important signal is black and white thinking. Relationships are interpreted in absolute terms. Either the relationship feels good or it must be fundamentally wrong. There is little tolerance for the gray areas, where most long-term relationships actually exist. From a parental perspective, the most important warning sign is this: the tendency to resolve discomfort by cutting off contact rather than adjusting the relationship. When that pattern appears repeatedly, it indicates that the individual may not yet possess the emotional framework required for complex family relationships. Another subtle signal appears in the way past conflicts are described. When individuals speak about previous disagreements with their own parents, the explanations may sound surprisingly simple. We just didn't get along. It was always difficult. I just couldn't deal with it. What is missing in these explanations is the process. There is little discussion about how conflicts developed, how they were addressed, or what each side felt. When conflict narratives remain this vague, it often indicates that the person has not yet developed a structured understanding of relational dynamics. A dangerous stage, but also a window of opportunity. It is important to understand that. These signals are both warnings and opportunities. Yes, they reveal potential risks in future family relationships, but they also reveal something else. The emotional patterns we see at this stage are not yet permanently fixed. They are still flexible enough to be reshaped. With guidance, mediation, education, or counseling, individuals can learn new ways of interpreting conflict. They can begin to see disagreement not as rejection, but as negotiation. They can learn that discomfort in relationships does not automatically mean failure, but this opportunity exists only for a limited period of time. If these early reactions are dismissed simply as personality traits, she is just like that, then something more permanent begins to form. Temporary reactions slowly harden into beliefs. Beliefs eventually become identity. And once relational withdrawal becomes part of someone's identity, changing it becomes far more difficult. The turning point. There is an old proverb that says, when a meal is eaten too quickly, it causes pain in the stomach. When a marriage is decided too quickly, it may leave a lifetime of regret. the emotional reactions we observe in. The 20s often belong to this fragile stage. They are not final decisions. They are attempts to escape situations that feel emotionally overwhelming. That is precisely why this stage should not be ignored. But it should also not be judged too harshly, because the difference between a temporary retreat and a permanent rupture often depends on whether the signals are recognized early. If they are ignored, today's avoidance may become tomorrow's conviction. And once that conviction forms, persuasion, mediation, and reconciliation become far more difficult. In today's lecture, we explored how some individuals in their 20s begin moving toward emotional distance in relationships with parents-in-law and what psychological patterns often appear along the way. In the next lecture, we will examine what happens when these patterns continue into the early 30s. Why do temporary emotional reactions gradually transform into fixed beliefs and personal identity? And why does intervention become dramatically more difficult at that stage? If you found this discussion helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and sharing it with others who may benefit from understanding the psychology behind family relationships. Because sometimes recognizing a pattern early can prevent a lifetime of distance.